This is the pilot episode of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. I'm Michael Cullinane, a historian, author, and the host of the show. As this is the pilot, I thought I would explain why I'm making the podcast. During the COVID pandemic, I began to feel professionally disconnected. All of those encounters that I used to have at seminars, book launches, conferences, and especially at the conference bars have all but disappeared. Twitter and Zoom are not really an alternative for those face-to-face meetings that I used to have with friends and colleagues. So I started this podcast as a way to reconnect and to make new connections. I want to talk to the authors of the latest publications. I want to hear from listeners about what interests them. And I want the podcast to be a forum for all things that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. I've always seen history as a means of connecting the past with the present and to the future. When I first began grad school, the Iraq War had intensified, and the nation was having a tough conversation about American imperialism and exceptionalism. I began studying anti-imperialism in the 19th century to make better sense of the protests against American intervention in the 21st century. And much of what I've written since has followed the same path, whether it be memorials erected in memory of Theodore Roosevelt or the way ideas persist in American history. I love my job, I love interpreting the past, but in all fairness, the task is pretty isolating. And I know that's not much of a revelation. Loneliness is one of the most common complaints of academics. Now, I suppose in an effort to offset my own pandemic loneliness, I'm starting this podcast to hear from others in a rich and vibrant community of scholars, and ideally to connect with a wider community of people that would like to learn more about the past. It's not hard to draw parallels between the Gilded Age and the early 21st century. There's a vast gap between the stark poverty of some and the inconceivable wealth of a few. And that divide is as large now as it was over 100 years ago. Mark Twain had called it the Gilded Age rather than the Golden Age because underneath the shiny surface of American life lurked an ugly, tarnished society. The Gilded Age, in a sense, was like fool's gold. It only resembled the real thing. The Gilded Age also marked the end of Reconstruction, naturally the starting point for Jim Crow laws and segregation. And in a future show, I'll speak with leading historians about the importance of the Civil War for the Gilded Age. Another major change came with the rise of modern capitalism. The railroads and telegraph connected people and places in new ways, but had profound implications for politics, society, and the economy. And you can think about the way the internet and the iPhone has transformed the world today, and it's quite similar in the Gilded Age with the railroad and the telegraph. And I've already mentioned anti-imperialism. The wars of conquest and consequence in this period extended the American empire overseas with colonies in the Pacific and the Caribbean. The United States became a global power in the Gilded Age. All of the tumult, violence, hazards, and divisions of the late 19th century sparked a reaction from activists and politicians at all levels of American government. The Progressive Era began to redress many of the grievances by direct elections, universal suffrage, public health initiatives, social welfare, labor rights, and environmental protections that transformed the United States again. So this podcast will explore all of the people, places, events, and key concepts that define the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and we'll even ask if the period should be called the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, whether there are two periods or one, and what alternative monikers might look like. The idea is to grapple with the past, embrace the debates and interpretations that rankle, and make us better educated and engaged. Now, the great thing about this is that there are so many parallels between the Gilded Age, Progressive Era, and today. I think we'll have plenty to talk about. If the pandemic is on your mind, and how could it not be, you'll find our first episode unmissable. I talked to Professor Christopher McKnight-Nichols about the 1918 influenza that has eerie parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you've not already seen Professor Nichols' Twitter feed and the images he shares, do check it out. The mask mandates of today have a historical precedent in the early 20th century. And if, like me, you spent much of the pandemic drinking more alcohol than you normally would, or should, don't miss episode 2 with Professor Cecilia Tichy. We talk about her new book, Gilded Age Cocktails, and how an American culture of excess clashed with the traditions of restraint and decorum. Professor Tichy has written about many aspects of American culture, and she manages to tell the story of the United States in every recipe she writes about. Finally, The third episode in the initial tranche explores the way women's reproductive rights as we know them today has its roots in the progressive era. Professor Barbara Schneider will talk with me about her book, Corporal Rhetoric, which is a tour de force, a really great example of scholarship that transcends disciplinary boundaries. Professor Schneider will cover medical history, rhetoric, language studies, biography, and politics. And from this talk, we meet familiar characters like Theodore Roosevelt and Margaret Sanger in ways that we never really knew them. In future episodes, which will come out fortnightly, I'll bring you stories about W.E.B. Du Bois, railroad tycoons, environmental history, literature, music, and much more. Presidents, plutocrats, Pentecostals, prisoners, anyone that was a part of the American experience. The focus of the podcast might be the United States, but the wider world intersects regularly, whether we're investigating migration, people, ideas, materials. I'm rather conscious of the international dimensions. Not only do I write about transatlantic diplomacy, but I grew up in New Jersey, I work in London, and I live in Ireland. The past cannot be explained in a domestic vacuum. If at any stage you have a question that you can't answer, I hope to hear from you. It just might be that we can find the answer together. So please get in touch via email if you like the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast because doing so will make a huge difference in sharing the content with wider audiences. You can subscribe on the show's website or via your podcast provider, and you can also check out the show's notes on the website. Here you can find further readings and links to resources for teaching and research. This is all about connecting, so don't be a stranger. I'm looking forward to sharing more about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era with you. Thanks for listening.